Welcome to Common Ground with Bill Walton, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Hi, I'm joined today by John Henry, Bruce Fein, and Bill Nitze. John is founder of the Citizens for the Republic, is an insurance executive, and is an author of a play that we want to talk today about the founding of our republic. Bruce Fein is a lawyer, and he's the author of American Empire Before the Fall. Bill Nitze is also a founder of the Citizens for Republic, and he is a lawyer and an expert in all things constitutional, as is Bruce Fein. Together, we are citizen actors. We're in a play, and John Henry is our author, written called, what is the name of our play, John?
Republic for Which We Stand.
Republic for Which We Stand, and we all play parts in the play. Bruce is our James Madison. Bill Nitze plays George Mason and Edward II, and I have the opportunity, great honor, to play George Washington and also Roger Mortimer, who was one of the great lovers of the Middle Ages. So thank you for that, John. John, tell us about our play, and then we're all going to talk a lot about the Republic and democracies and
good.
Republic.
The Committee for the Republic holds monthly salons here in D.C., and I started the Stonehill Theatrical Foundation to dramatize some of the themes that we pursued in the committee. And our principal focus is on presidential wars now. We have 9 going on now, unconstitutional, undeclared wars. And so the object of the play, Republic for Which We Stand, was to dramatize this. And so George Washington and the Virginia delegation went up to Philadelphia a little early, and they were sitting around waiting for a quorum to form. And the setting for the play is in Benjamin Franklin's home, where George has, George has commissioned many plays, on the real great wars in English history, William the Conqueror, Edward III, and Henry V, the Crecy and Agincourt kings. And so the founders sit around and watch these many plays, what was called at the time closet drama, and comment on that. And they make the decision to make a break with history and to do something that had never been done before in history, before a sense, which was to put the war power, the most important power, the decision to go to war, in the Congress rather than in the executive, where so that today is the issue that the committee is focused on, and this play is going to be exploring that dramatically with your great thespian talents, Bill.
We may be in trouble. We were talking before about George Washington really did commission plays, and he really did perform them at Valley Forge. Bill, was it you that was talking about that?
Yes. I was just fascinated when I read that at one of the low points in the Revolutionary War, when Washington's army was defeated, was being pursued, was going through a miserable freezing winter. His soldiers didn't have any boots. They were developing gangrene. A large number of them were deserting. Washington gathered together his officers and put together a performance of Addison's play on Cato. And Cato, of course, is the famous Roman who, rather than submit to Caesar, took his own life in Utica. And it was this example of Republican virtue in putting the Republic ahead of one's life that George Washington chose to display to his soldiers. So I've always found this very inspiring.
But I would add that what Cato didn't recognize and what I, as James Madison, did is that simply by taking his life, he wasn't really changing, the narrative of history. You just got another emperor. If it wasn't Caesar, it was Caesar Augustus. If it wasn't Caesar Augustus, it was Caligula. And that the lessons that the plays within the play teach is that simply changing the personalities is not sufficient if you are to safeguard against war. And the discussion of war is important, not simply because it's a constitutional infraction, it's because the framers understood in times of war, the law is silent. What is the definition of war? It's legalized murder. It's turning wives into widows, children into orphans. It's migrating your genius from production to destruction. It's huge debts. So it isn't, a technical argument for international lawyers to debate. It has critical impact on everyone.
What role did
in the
Madison?
citizen.
What role did Madison play in this in the founding of the Republic?
Well,
Tell us about your character.
He was instrumental. Madison, for months before the convention assembled in May of 1787, he had Thomas Jefferson, who was then a commissioner in France, gather up books on every single confederation in the history of mankind, and he shipped them over in chests. And Madison studied all of them in order to deduce what kind of universal truths that he could find from history that would inform how he would propose to refashion the United States from the Articles of Confederation that really wasn't a unifying document. It really kept the country with 13 separate sovereigns. And so he came up, he drafted the Virginia Plan. Now it's credited to Randolph because Madison was a self-effacing personality, kind of the opposite of what you find in Washington. Everybody is egomaniacal here.
You
But
don't last
Madison-
long in Washington
Madison
doing
was not.
self-effacing. Yeah.
So, and he was the one
Yeah.
also, Bill, that at the convention he took notes and was the one who was the scrivener and why we know what the debates were about the various provisions of the Constitution.
And John, if the way this is written, Madison is our hero.
That's right.
And
Yes, let me say a word about the villain of this play.
I was
which is
just coming to that. Very
is
good.
Which is Alexander
Let's
Hamilton.
talk about the villain, yeah.
And in my early outings on behalf of the committee, in the Inn at Little Washington and elsewhere, actually the courthouse at Little Washington, I have played Hamilton. And there is an interesting relationship between Hamilton and Madison, which was not all oppositional. Because I think Madison accepted that in order for the United States to survive, it needed a federal government with certain powerful functions, including control over credit, the ability to raise armies with congressional consent. Hamilton was not as strong on the balance of powers as perhaps we would like, and that comes out in the play. But there was an exception of our founders of the need for quite a strong central government. And based on my reading of history, they were right, because the United States at the beginning was in a very weak position. It had no credit, it had no functioning institutions, and was susceptible to foreign powers.
Well, I think
Well, if I could interject, because I think this is critical, Bill, I apologize, though, that the critical difference between Madison and Hamilton wasn't over whether you needed a stronger central government. It was whether the powers that were to be dominant were to be the legislative power as opposed to the executive. And that's where Madison understood. You give power to the executive, it's inevitable. He understood that George Washington was a prodigy. It'd take 500 years where you could get an executive who would turn down the opportunity to be a king, which is what Hamilton offered him. And that's the critical element that Madison understood and Hamilton didn't. And that early on appeared with regard to Hamilton's celebration of the Neutrality Proclamation, where he wanted the president to be able to make conduct a crime on his own. That's in the Neutrality Proclamation that Hamilton celebrated. The president making a crime on his own while getting into Congress. And that's really the key to the distinction, is why how we evolved as a nation. If we began with an overwhelming executive, which we have now de facto, we would have been crumbled as an empire probably 100 years ago.
Well,
the Madisonian view prevailed for about a century.
Let me ask the man in the street question. Well, aren't we a democracy? And if we have a majority elects a president, isn't that the final word?
No,
Give
that,
Author?
Give him
Give our author a little
him the
airtime
Madison.
here.
Give him the Madison.
Yeah, this is
Okay,
quoting
all
from
right,
my
quote.
author. No, we're not a democracy, and it's not because there's any essential denigration of popular
For the record,
sentiment.
I knew the answer to the question, but I.
But this is, I think the critical element is that in a republic, as is what we have, the goal of government, of civil society, is justice, not simple majority rule. Because majorities can be as oppressive as oligarchies and kings. And so, as Madison points out with the playwright's assistance in offering the words, we don't have simple majorities. We have built in 9 or 10 checks on simple majority rule. We have separate rules for electing the House and the Senate and the President. We have a bicameral legislature. We have supermajorities for treaties and constitutional amendments and confirmation of presidential nominations. We have an independent Supreme Court that's empowered to invalidate all of the decisions of the electoral branches of government. And and the whole idea here was to require a broad consensus amongst different factions before the government could operate at all. Because the idea was, if we're checking government, what's in a pejorative way said, oh, we've got gridlock. Gridlock means you and I we have our liberty to chart our own destinies with gridlock.
We're for gridlock.
We're for gridlock,
Yeah, love it.
and you should only
have
be able
enough
to
of
get
it.
out of gridlock if you have various consensus among the different factions of society.
I might add that we've noticed that Bruce plays Madison in John's play, but he is Madison in real life.
Right.
And I
If you had
suspect,
to choose
I
between-
suspect you've read all the books that Madison read before he came to the conclusions he came to. Is that right?
Yes, but I read additional books that he didn't have, and that's in some
had
sense.
more time,
in some
more data
sense,
points.
Yeah, in some sense, that's why if you read Bill, his description of what would happen with the executive, given the war power, says war is the nurse of executive expansion and arrogance. And he describes about how war excites the vanity of the president to leave footprints in the sands of time, and he gets the authority to dispense favors and to spend money. I mean, it fits our mentality today like a glove. And he's writing 227 years ago, and he got it right.
John, you want to weigh in? I mean, the author does get to say something about this.
Oh, well, I think Bruce has done Madison is Madison. And, the play is about Madison, the conflict between Madison and Hamilton over what the American Revolution meant, how to translate it into a new form of government.
Well, as the author, I mean, how do you make it interesting? Because you've got all these old guys, 250, 230 years ago doing all this. How do you make it entertaining? Why would somebody want to
Well, I think
go
you have
watch
to do a
this?
number of things.
And is it all a bunch of men that are cast in this play?
Women are very important.
The women have carry half the conversation. So Martha Washington has as much to say as you do.
I've noticed that. She has better lines, too.
More forceful ones.
More formal.
And Bill, who plays George Mason, his wife has as many lines, and Sarah and Bill is Bruce, who plays Madison. He has Dolly Madison to deal with, and so she's quite a character. She's full of things to say. So the women are carrying half the substance of the conversation over the war power. So that works in terms of getting attention. And then we use a lot of humor. Humor is very important because if you want to slip some instruction in, you better have people laughing. Yeah. So we have them laughing a lot.
Well, I think I can attest to the humor. I think Bill playing Edward II is one of the more interesting and fun parts of the play. What do you have? Annie, what is the line from South Pacific? You're just a what? You're just a king who can't say
no. This came
What is
from
that?
Oklahoma.
Can you do that, Bill?
Can you run that line?
No. Can you do that rendition?
Well, I'm just a king who can't say no. I'm in a terrible fix. I always say, come on, let's go, when I ought to say Nick. But
They'd get you into trouble today with sexual harassment. You related to
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein?
I mean, I'm
true.
But Bill, you play you switch in from you go in and you're part of the mini play as Edward II, and we give you the Richard the second death scene, which is, I think, one of my favorite passage in any of Shakespeare's plays. Could you do that for us?
Well, all right. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Some were betrayed, some slayed in war, some poisoned by their wives, some haunted by ghosts they deposed, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which rounds our body were brass impregnable. And humored thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Now, this is a very eloquent passage, and I hope that certain people...
Brilliantly rendered. Thank you.
I think, Bill, one of the lessons that you can extrapolate from that eloquent recitation is that despite the fact that kings come and go, they get killed, nothing changes as long as the institutional structure remains unchanged. So you just have a series of one king comes in, strong king, weak king, but the same evils, the same problems reoccur.
But Bill and I both agree, we were talking about this beforehand, I mean, aren't our institutional structures rather frayed now? I mean, you look at the way Congress has abrogated a lot of its power to the executive branch and saying, basically, we've got a health care bill. By the way, the bureaucrats, you go write it. So we're not really looking at the structure that we had when we founded the country.
Because we don't have any institutional separation anymore. You're exactly right, Bill. The Congress has turned into what I call the invertebrate branch. It has surrendered eagerly its powers to the executive. So we don't have separation like it used to. I mean, the bills, I'm working on some reforms to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The intelligence committees farm out the drafting to the intelligence community. So the CIA and the NSA write the bill, and they come back in and they change a semicolon. And that's the end of it. So that the Madisonian vision has been de facto destroyed by a lack of courage, by cowardice in Congress. They don't want to vote on anything significant. They worry about a primary challenge, and they want to flee from responsibility. But that can't be blamed on Madison. He couldn't change the DNA. He could build an institution, but if the occupants want to give away all the power, that's nothing you can prevent that.
If I may make a comment, we actually still have the Constitution. It's been amended, but on the issues we're talking about, it has not been significantly amended since the Civil War amendments. So there's an interplay here between human corruption and undermining the effectiveness of the institutions that still remain by refusing to live up to constitutional responsibilities. And when Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic if you can keep it," he was anticipating exactly the forces which are leading us to risk losing it. And those forces are very powerful because America is a very rich country. We have become a very powerful country. And we have developed a mythology which is partially from the Old Testament, and John wrote a play about this, where we have convinced ourselves that we are a redeemer nation inhabited by a chosen people who have license to go and remake the world in our image, and that, yes, we're going to make some mistakes, but people are lucky that we're out there doing our job.
John, how many wars have we been in since the founding? Country?
Oh, gosh, probably, it depends on how you count it, but hundreds.
And how many did Congress declare?
Only 5.
5.
So we've only had 5 constitutional wars.
And
but the problem has really gotten, we've had basically, it's Bill was saying, we've had an Old Testament foreign policy of good guys and bad guys for 5 generations now since Wilson. And on the presidential wars, we're 3 generations into it. So these problems that we're talking about are not something that just happened yesterday in our generation. They've been building up over time, and both political parties are they're the part of the problem. They're both committed to an oversized executive and turning, as Bruce was saying, the judiciary and the legislature into rubber stamps and ink blots.
Yeah, and part of that comes from the very prescient understanding of President Eisenhower in his farewell address when he spoke about the undue influence, the military-industrial complex, I call it the military-industrial counterterrorism complex, and it's grown by leaps and bounds. The one thing they're expert at, they distribute the manufacturing of these weapons in the various districts where the chairmen sit, and when they go up to brief the member of Congress, the first thing the member looks like, hey, how many jobs in my district? They don't ask whether you need the weapons, why are you fighting over there? That's the first and last question they ask. And they don't want to accept responsibility. They don't even want to know. Things are so bad, Bill. About 11 years ago, I sat down with Congressman Walter Jones on Armed Services Committee of in the House, North Carolina. And so he drafted a bill. This is after the weapons, the WMD, the lies that were told about the purchase of yellow cake by Niger and whatever. So a simple bill. It would make it a crime for a president with knowledge and intent and malice to make a material lie to Congress to get an authorization for war. The fact that you'd have to have a bill speaks volumes. And when we had a hearing, the members, well, gee, Mr. Fein and Congress, we don't want to vote on that. The president might not go to as many wars as they ought to go on. This is 11 years ago. They didn't want, they thought it would be all right for the president.
What's the name of this bill?
It's called the Executive Accountability Act of 2006.
And is it still in the?
No,
it's gone?
the bills, if
All right.
it isn't enacted after 2 years, it expires.
you're done.
But that's just an example, I think, of the congressional
Yeah.
The
cravenness.
situation that Bruce is describing, I think, reflects something much deeper. One of the things that I have learned from these two gentlemen and from the committee itself is the importance of studying history and having a frank exchange of ideas among people of goodwill. Most Americans, unfortunately, are woefully ignorant of history, and we don't have the kind of discussion among citizens
That we have,
that we need to have on a whole range of issues, none more important than the issues we're discussing here. And Sandra Day O'Connor and others are trying to revitalize the teaching of civics in high schools in the United States. I frankly don't believe that most high school students in this country know what the term citizen means. And they certainly don't know that the idea of citizenship reflects responsibility towards the republic of which you are a citizen and putting that responsibility ahead of your own narrow self-interest. This would be an alien idea to many Americans. It remains to a certain degree in the military because it's part of the military ethos. But it needs to be revitalized throughout our society, and we need to begin to have a different kind of discussion. It's not a matter of what position you take. It's a matter of engaging with issues in a forthright, honest way and being willing to put yourself at risk.
Well, but that gets at the in-state point you were making about justice. And I think one of the problems that you're articulating about education is everything now is relativistic, is whatever you feel is right for you, and whatever you feel is right for you, and so therefore we're not going to agree on what justice is because it means something different to everyone. I think that's a problem.
Well, it is a huge problem, but one of the reasons why that's true is because they don't teach any standards for determining, what justice is, which is what Madison was preoccupied with, Aristotle's preoccupied with, Socrates preoccupied with that. Justice, making certain that you don't prejudge things without having due process, treating everyone with dignity, not acting with ulterior motives, all those sorts of things. Now, it's true, there's only so much. The words can be infinitely manipulated if you want to. You can call Mephistopheles God and God Mephistopheles. You know, so Abraham Lincoln once said, well, how many legs does a dog have if his tail called it a leg? He'd say he still has 4 because calling it the tail a leg doesn't make it so. And so the problem that you identified here is there's total reluctance to make any judgment at all. You have to have some judgments. Otherwise, we wouldn't even punish murder unless we thought murder was bad. We wouldn't punish rape unless we thought rape was bad. So, and that's a problem that we have in the educational system. And it's not only the idea of justice that's, in my judgment, has got to be foremost. When Grover Cleveland's first inaugural, this is over a century ago, when he delivered an address and he said, no, I take an oath to support the Constitution. But he said, you citizens, the Constitution is yours, not mine. And it's your understanding of the Constitution that's going to leave its imprint upon what I can do and what the Congress can do on the country. And that's got to come back into force because the American people don't insist on enforcing the Constitution through the vote, through popular opinion. And you just get a government of wolves, right? You may have people as sheep get a government of wolves. It was true when Edward R. Murrow said it. It's true today. And that's what we don't teach. When's the last time we've heard an inaugural address telling the people the Constitution is yours, not mine?
It's even worse than that. They have done polls recently on public awareness of the First Amendment. Over half of the people asked could only identify one of the 5 rights enshrined in the First Amendment. And that not very well. That was freedom of speech. There was no knowledge of freedom of assembly. There was no knowledge of freedom of the press. There was no knowledge of freedom of religion. There was no knowledge of freedom of association. And one of the difficulties here is that by not understanding the breadth of these rights enshrined in the First Amendment, people default to, gosh, I feel badly. This position that, X group is good and Y group is bad, that feels good because I'm a member of X group. Let's go for it. And when people get into that frame of mind, when they don't understand the underpinnings of a Republican culture, we're in deep trouble.
Go ahead.
Because we can't have any sort of an honest discussion that leads to recognition of diverse interests and political compromise.
And I think we're pretty clear, you used the word republic. This is not a Republican versus Democrat issue. This is something very different. This is, John, you want to weigh in on?
Well, what we have in the drama, in the play, is a dramatization of what we're talking about, which is a citizen identity. And to have a citizen identity, you basically have to respect the opinions of your fellow man. And the idea that somehow we should all think the same things is just utter nonsense. I mean, I wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody thought the same way. I mean, the only reason you have politics and markets is because there are differences in the way people see things. So we, at the committee, we basically have people from right of center and left of center, and we get them together and we break down.
What is the composition roughly in terms of the committee? How do people line up?
Well, I think we have we have people on the board, a number who voted for Trump, a number who voted for Hillary. We don't have a consensus on anything other than Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which is the declare war clause. And so that's what the play is about.
I will amend that. We do have a consensus on one thing, and I think generally we've adhered to this. We are respectful of diverse opinions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We do not get angry with each other. We do not, walk out in a huff. We do not.
We engage.
Can I recommend you start creating subchapters on college campuses?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a good idea.
It's an idea which ought to catch fire.
I think it's important to understand why the war power kind of is the cornerstone of the debate. And that's because it's like an infectious disease. The war power breeds the surveillance state. It creates a warfare state that goes into the surveillance state. Now the NSA, they spy on everything that moves, and the drones take pictures, and I'm sure down the road they will be at Big Brother that even George Orwell couldn't think of.
So the end defines the end is so defined justifies any means. And
Well, exactly,
means becomes the welfare state.
because if
Okay.
you're at war, then
And you can
anything
ration people, you can
anything
set
goes.
prices,
Yeah.
you
Anything
can,
goes.
Dude, and that's where we are. I mean,
Yeah.
we have, the NSA gathers so much information, and not only just on you and me, they gather information on what
Everybody
members
knows.
of Congress are saying, what lawyers tell clients, what doctors tell patients, what judges talk in their chambers. You know, and it doesn't do any good. They're collecting it for its own sake. So we breed a surveillance state, and then we breed a bailout state, because the whole idea behind this war power that's got to be used everywhere is no risk existence. Okay, no risk in war, no risk in business. You bail out everybody. The big banks get all this money, and then it breeds into the welfare state, and we become a very effete nation. Don't want to take, everybody's got to be bailed out no matter what. So we last, so why do we have these eggshell students at college? They can't even deal, you know, with an epithet, with an adjective they don't like. Could you imagine fighting at Valley Forge with soldiers who would be horrified and traumatized if they heard a word they didn't like? I mean, it is
we'd all have British
unbelievable.
accents.
So, I mean, and the whole First Amendment is about protecting the speech we hate. You don't need a First Amendment to protect the speech you love.
Right.
It's got to protect the speech you hate. You don't necessarily agree to it, but yeah, maybe they have something to offer.
And that principle applies to all 5 of the freedoms in the First Amendment, including freedom of association. John and I have a special reason for feeling strongly about this issue of freedom of association. But it is, and it gets into this issue of removing statues, and, I mean, people have to understand that many of the figures they're talking about are complex individuals who lived in a very different time than today and responded to very different circumstances than today. And there has to be a nuanced, in-depth understanding of history. It's fine to draw moral judgments, but it is not fine to engage in gestures when you don't even attempt to understand the issues that underlie the lives of the people.
Well, that gets at
affected.
our current passion for pulling down statues. And tell me about the characters of the founders and why they're misunderstood when you look at them through today's lens, and how they saw, for example, slavery then. I mean, why is that you know, that's our original sin as a country. I mean, how do we get past that?
Well,
I'll let you.
no,
Take that one.
this
I'm
is
not sure that was maybe 4 or 5 questions.
Yeah,
but,
no, it's a critical issue, and of course the framers, they understood the evil of slavery, and they didn't try to ignore it. One element was only to permit states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of getting representation in the House. It watered down a little bit of the slave culture in the South. And, you know, I think the dilemma was captured in Thomas Jefferson during his sunset years, and he said, I tremble when I reflect that God is just, and God's justice cannot sleep forever. He did not, you know, emancipate his slaves. He probably had an affair with Sally Hemings. But they struggled with it, and clearly understood it was contrary to the doctrines that were in the Declaration of Independence. Now, what I think they thought, and Madison especially, he did want to manumit all his slaves and told Dolly to do so, but she didn't obey him strictly. What that over time, the Constitution only forbade 2 kinds of amendments. You couldn't destroy the equal representation of the states in the Senate, and you couldn't forbid the slave trade earlier than 1808. So what was anticipated is, as the country expanded, once you had a majority or 2/3 of free states, then through constitutional legal means, slavery could disappear. So they built in a mechanism. Now, you got to understand, if you're a slave and it takes long years, that doesn't really help you. So they struggled with that. But it wasn't as though they were indifferent, you know, to the problem of slavery, even if many of them didn't have the courage and say, I'm walking away. But many of them did emancipate their slaves as well.
Yeah, this is a sensitive point. I am deeply sympathetic with African Americans generally, and specifically ones who have suffered from discrimination. And they are not only entitled to speak out, but they should speak out. And they should be listened to. And change should be made. And change has been made, but more changes are needed. But all of us have to somehow find a way of dealing with these very difficult questions of injustice at a real human level and not default to symbolism, and particularly not to default to symbolism when it is symbolism that cuts off engagement and discussion. This is a very hard point. I know it's a point that Martin...
Symbolism as in statues or symbolism?
Sometimes as
Yeah,
in
okay.
statues. And all cases are not the same.
But these aren't really, this isn't the subject of our play.
No,
It's not the subject of the play, but it's...
Our play is focused on the war power and what we need to do about it.
Yeah, let's circle back to the play. We've got a few minutes remaining because it's we've missed a lot of things I want to cover. The play has 3 plays within a play.
Right,
And we have William the Conqueror,
right,
who created the English warfare state,
right.
and which is, by the way, one of my lines. Thank you, John, for that. We have Edward III,
Right.
and we had Henry VIII, or Henry V.
Henry V, yeah.
And Henry V was I guess he was Agincourt?
Agincourt was,
Edward III?
Crécy was Edward III,
Yeah.
and then 67 years later, the same crossbow battle plan was reenacted at Agincourt.
And these English monarchs vivify what
Oh,
we
these
must
guys!
avoid.
They didn't just do regime change; they were going after whole countries. I mean, they were taking whole countries.
And we
not-
also
not-
talk about how feudal it was. France would invade England, England would invade France. It went back and
the
forth.
borders
for-
were going back and forth
Yeah.
in France the way they are in Syria and Iraq now for 400 years. And the founders looked at these 3 strong warrior kings in English history and said, we don't want to go down that road. We don't want a warfare state.
Yeah.
We want a republic. And so in order to have a republic rather than an empire, we have to do something that hasn't been done, because we've had 67 empires in the last 3,000 years. At that time, they didn't have as many at the count. But they knew enough to know that basically if you wanted to be a republic rather than an empire, the most important thing you had to do was to put the war power in the Congress.
And we're using our play the way the Greeks used plays. And the
Yeah,
Greeks had a
exactly.
view that play, we talked about education, the Greeks used plays
For instruction.
as we talk about for
Not just-
instruction
right.
and entertainment, but instruction primarily in civic virtues and how to be,
And
how
they
to be a
use citizen
citizen.
actors to do it. Those are the
Yeah.
2 big ideas that, Rick Davis, who is our director, who heads the performing
He's a
arts.
big deal director. He
Oh my
runs the
God,
George
he's,
Mason.
he runs the whole
yeah.
performing arts.
Citizen actors and citizen playwrights. The Athenian tragedies were written by citizens who engaged in competitions, and they were meant to be performed for one festival of Dionysus. So it was citizens through and through, and there was active audience participation. We should create this same culture of involvement.
Right, so
in
our
every high
cast
school in
is
the
all
country.
citizen actors, and we have people like 3 of you who are amateurs, not
We're-
professionals, but
we're in it- we're in it
you're
for the money
you're
and-
very serious about acting. When we started, we, as we were saying earlier, the citizen identity requires that you engage with your fellow citizens. As we were saying, political segregation has replaced racial segregation in this country, and so what we need to do is talk to each other and talk about what the 2 political parties are taking off the table, which Bruce and Bill have alluded to: the warfare state, the too big to fail bailout state, the people that control the money and the violence. So what we've done in this play is dramatize how the founders came to the decision to put the war power. It had never been done before or since in history. And to make it, Bruce's point when he said that it's institutions that are important rather than personalities. So how do you convey in a play this very abstract idea of institutions having personalities? And what we do is we have the line that the executive is like a
Pit bull.
Pit bull.
and the legislature is like a Labrador Retriever, and that makes it approachable.
I want to pay John an additional compliment because he's taken on the gender issue in a very interesting way in this play. And Joan of Arc is normally considered a great spiritual heroine who taught the English an important lesson. But in John's play, she's as deluded as the kings that she replaces. Because although France regains its territorial integrity, she is deluded with this idea of being God's warrior. And of course, nobody is God's warrior.
She's promoting the French warfare state rather than the British warfare state.
Right. And so John puts in Joan of Arc with a lot of encouragement from other participants. Not Joan of Arc, the Virgin Mary. And the poor Virgin Mary, who has the voice of love and virtue in the play, is overwhelmed.
Well, but as
We actually have that line. We have William the Conqueror's wife looks at her and says, "Why are you saying all these things? Nobody ever listens to you."
well, that's true, but we also have her say, Joan or Virgin, you may be played your role, but I talk to God. And Joan claims as her because
Right.
she has voices, she's in charge.
Even though she's Catholic and not hasn't disintermediated, she talks directly to God.
We need to wrap up. I hate to do that because we've got such an interesting conversation going. John, the play is November 7th.
Yep.
We're in the U.S. Capitol in the Visitor Center.
It's a great
That's
privilege.
pretty unusual, isn't it?
Very.
How did we get into the Capitol?
Well, we had
Center?
to have legislation, and so,
Yeah.
Walter Jones.
we have Walter Jones has put in the committee's resolution defining a presidential war as an impeachable offense. For the first time in 227 years that's been done. So we're laying the standard down.
Okay, and because of that, we're going to be in the Capitol Visitors November 7th.
We're going to have a very good discussion. When we give him the award, and then after the play, we're going to have a discussion about this.
Now, I assume even though we're citizen actors, you're going to make us rehearse between now and then?
Oh, yes.
Well, this is a great thing. Our citizen actors can't get enough rehearsals. So.
No, that's true.
Well, thank you, guys. It's been a great show. I'm glad to have you on, and we
Good.
learned a lot.
Thank you.
We're
Thank
looking
you.
forward to
It's a lot of fun.
the next
Yeah.
version. Okay, thanks.
Onward and upward.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe to Common Ground with Bill Walton on iTunes.